Okay, so like imagine you're about to go into this really important meeting, right? The pressure's on, everything's on the line. Do you just like run in head first, or do you kind of hang back, strategize, figure out the best time and place to make your move?
I like that. And that's really what Clausewitz wants us to think about with battles.
It's not just about the fight itself, it's about the decisions that lead up to it.
Yeah.
And for you listening, I mean, that's probably second nature, right?
Right.
You got that experience. But even though Clausewitz was writing back in the 19th century, his book on war still has a ton to teach us about conflict in general, even outside of the military.
Oh, absolutely. Whether you're, leading troops or just trying to navigate a tough negotiation, his ideas are surprisingly relevant.
So let's dive into this chapter where he tackles choosing when and where to engage. He starts with this comparison that I found kind of strange. At first, he says a battle is like a duel.
Yeah, it sounds a little strange at first.
Yeah, does that even work?
Well, what he's getting at is this idea of mutual consent. Like, in a duel, both sides have to agree to fight. It's not just one person attacking the other out of nowhere, but, and I think this is really important, battles aren't some isolated event. They're part of a bigger war with larger strategic goals. So deciding to fight a battle is a much bigger deal than just agreeing to a duel.
It's about what you're hoping to achieve in the long run, not just winning that one fight.
Exactly. And that's something that Clausewitz argues was very different in his time compared to how battles were fought in, say, ancient times.
What changed? Was it just the technology getting better?
Technology played a role, but it's bigger than that. Think about ancient warfare. You've got these formal battles, often on open plains. Avoiding a fight back then was easier because armies weren't as mobile and the terrain could give you a big advantage. But by Clausewitz's time, armies are faster, more adaptable, thanks to better artillery, communication, things like that.
So terrain still matters, but technology evens the playing field.
Right. And that meant avoiding a fight, if the other side was determined to engage, became a lot harder.
So this idea of offering battle, which Clausewitz talks about a lot, did that just become meaningless by the 19th century?
Pretty much, yeah. He says it had become almost meaningless. Because by then, if a commander really wanted to force a fight, they could usually find a way.
So choosing not to fight was more of a strategic decision.
Exactly. It often meant you were in a weaker position, not that you couldn't engage.
So you might be able to take them, but it's just not the right time or place for it. There's too much at risk. And to illustrate this whole shift in how battles were fought, Clausewitz brings up several historical examples, battles like Neresheim, Rosbach, Sohr.
Yeah, he uses those battles a lot.
What makes them so important? Were they all decisive victories or something?
Each one highlights a different piece of his argument. Like, Neresheim shows how a well-planned retreat, even though it might feel like a loss, can actually be more strategic than just fighting to the death.
It's about surviving to fight another day.
Exactly. Then you have Rosbach, where one side completely misjudged the enemy's intentions, and it was a disaster. And Sohr, that battle emphasizes how important it is to consider everything. Terrain, enemy strength, potential gains and losses, the whole 9 yards before deciding whether to fight or not.
So these battles weren't just important for their time, but for the lessons they taught about strategy.
Precisely.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking about choosing your battles, knowing when to fight and when to hold back. But what if the enemy is really good at avoiding a fight? How do you force them to engage when you want them to? What does Clausewitz say about that?
Well, Clausewitz talks about a couple of main methods. One is surrounding the enemy, basically boxing them in so thoroughly that retreat is either impossible or at least so risky that they have to fight.
So they've got nowhere to go. They have to face you head on. I see. What's the second one?
Surprise, if you can catch the enemy completely off guard.
You can gain a decisive advantage.
You would think so, right? But Clausewitz actually argues that by the 19th century, surprise was becoming less effective, and that's largely because armies were just so much faster and more mobile.
Yeah. So they can react and redeploy much quicker than they used to.
Exactly. And with better intelligence gathering, it's much harder to achieve that total element of surprise.
Makes sense. Okay, so surprise is maybe not as reliable as it once was.
Yeah.
But what about that first method, the whole surrounding the enemy thing? Is that still a sound tactic?
It can be, but Clausewitz points out that it tends to be more effective with smaller forces. Trying to encircle a large, well-supplied army is a massive undertaking, and logistically speaking, it's just not always practical, especially with the challenges of 19th century warfare.
Right, you can't just like build a wall around them.
Exactly.
It reminds me a little bit of like a strategic retreat in the business world. Sometimes you have to pull back, reposition yourself, even if it seems like you're losing ground in the short term. in order to gain a better advantage down the line.
That's a great analogy, and that actually ties into something really important about Clausewitz. He saw these principles as being applicable beyond just the battlefield. He famously said that war is a continuation of politics by other means, and I think this idea of choosing when and where to fight, it applies to so many things. Negotiations, planning, leadership, really any kind of conflict.
It's about understanding your goals and then picking the right battles to help you achieve those goals.
Exactly. And sometimes, maybe the smartest move is not to fight at all. It might mean recognizing that a strategic retreat, even if it feels like a concession in the moment, is actually going to put you in a stronger position for the future.
Like you said, it's about playing the long game.
Absolutely.
Wow. This is really making me rethink how I approach conflict in general. But before we move on, I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier about Clausewitz believing that both sides in a battle have to agree to fight.
The whole duel analogy.
Yeah, that one. How does that hold up in modern warfare with things like guerrilla tactics or cyber warfare?
Ooh, that is a fantastic question. And it really gets to the heart of how warfare has evolved. In Clausewitz's time, you're mostly talking about these two uniformed armies facing each other on a clearly defined battlefield. But modern warfare is often a lot more complex and messy.
How so?
Well, think about things like guerrilla warfare, terrorism, cyber attacks. They don't really fit neatly into those traditional categories. They blur the lines of what even constitutes warfare. There isn't always a clear battlefield or even a clearly defined enemy.
So in those situations, how does that whole idea of mutual consent even work?
That is the million-dollar question,
Right.
right? And it's something that military strategists and ethicists are still grappling with today. If the lines between war and peace or between combatants and civilians become blurred, then how do you even begin to apply Clausewitz's ideas?
It's like the rules of the duel have changed, but nobody's quite sure what the new rules are yet.
Exactly. And understanding those new rules, or at least recognizing that the old ones might not apply anymore, is absolutely essential if we're going to navigate the complexities of modern conflict.
Wow, so much to think about. But on that note, is there anything else from this chapter that really stood out to you? Something you think our listener, with their experience and their dedication to service, could really take away from this deep dive?
It's funny how when Clausewitz talks about how warfare was changing in his time, he almost seems to predict how important it would become to win decisively on the battlefield.
What do you mean? Why were those clear-cut victories becoming so crucial in the 19th century?
Well, remember we were talking about how armies were getting more mobile, more flexible?
Right.
Those older ways of fighting where armies would maneuver around for ages without really engaging, those were becoming less and less effective.
Because you couldn't just rely on outmaneuvering the enemy or wearing them down slowly anymore.
Yeah, exactly. To really cripple the enemy, to break their will to keep fighting, you needed those big, decisive victories on the battlefield. It's almost like he's foreshadowing the kind of warfare that dominated the 20th century.
Which takes us right back to his whole point about choosing your battles carefully. You don't just jump into a major fight unless you're pretty sure you can win and win decisively.
Yep. Because if you don't, the cost might not be worth it, not just in terms of resources, but in.
Human life.
Exactly.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. I think our listener will find a lot of these ideas, really relevant to their own experiences.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, what's one big takeaway, one thought-provoking idea that you hope our listener will take away from Clausewitz?
I think the most important thing to remember from Clausewitz is that understanding conflict, whether it's on a battlefield, in a negotiation, even just our own personal lives, it's a process. It never really ends. We have to keep questioning our assumptions, adapt to new realities, and most importantly, be willing to learn new things.
Because the moment you think you have all the answers,
That's when you become truly vulnerable.
so true. It's about staying engaged, staying curious, never being afraid to ask questions. And that is a powerful message. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of Carl von Clausewitz.
My pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you for your service. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and choose your battles wisely.